You're listening to Write Right with the Story Perfect editing team. Visit us at www.storyperfectediting.com for more information on developmental editing, copy editing, and proofreading services for your writing. Season 1, Episode 8. Hello, listeners, and welcome to Episode 8 of the Write Right podcast with Story Perfect's editing team. My name is Elon. I am an apprentice editor with Story Perfect, and why don't we just go straight into what I'm reading instead of doing like a roundabout and then roundabout again. Currently reading Dreams of Distant Shores by Tachyon Publication, it's by Patricia A. McKillop, published by Tachyon Publications. They're very kind and they send me books to read and review, so I'm usually reading something by them. But so far it's delightful, but I haven't gotten terribly far into it. How about you, John?
I'm John, and I am the senior editor at Story Perfect. Right now, I am still reading Fellowship of the Ring.
Oh, no.
So when I'm not snowed in with all kinds of editing work, I do pick away at my reading, but I'm enjoying reading this very slowly. I actually read a couple books at the same time, so I'm also working my way through Stephen James' Story Trump Structure. So I like to generally alternate between something that's all about learning more about fiction craft and just pure fiction for the fun of it. So I could say I read 130 pages.
How about you, Katie?
I'm Katie. I am copy editor at Story Perfect.
Oh.
Sorry. We're all glitchy today.
Yeah, there's a bunch of glitches happening.
That's all right. So I'm reading a collection of comics called Moonshot.
That looks really cool.
That it's awesome. It's a collection of Native American comics published by a publisher that only does Native American work and is employed by Native Americans, and they only publish Native American authors. And I found them at a Comic-Con booth that was real pretty, so I went in and I bought a bunch of books, and I'm working my way through that right now. It's awesome.
Awesome.
What about you, Ian?
Hello, I'm Ian, and I am an apprentice editor at Story Perfect. Currently, I'm reading Elantris by Brandon Sanderson.
It's a really good one.
Yeah, it's a good book.
Yeah, I'm a big Brandon Sanderson fan, so I love hearing when people are reading his books. And I know that a lot of people aren't huge fans, and you know what? That's okay. There's a lot of books in the world, and I'll get over it someday.
If you enjoy Elantris, Ian, make sure you check out Mistborn. That was probably my favorite of all the books that he's ever written.
Okay, cool. So this time we are going to be talking about a topic that Ian brought up during one of our last podcasts when we were talking about breaking the rules. And Ian mentioned that it's a completely different kettle of fish when we talk about dialogue. Because, inline narration is pretty formal and strict about its rules, but we all know that people don't actually talk using formal prescriptive grammar. So we wanted to talk about what breaking the rules means within dialogue and, surrounding dialogue. And so I'm going to kick it over to, we were just discussing this right before I hit record. And we had a few really good things going at the beginning. So let's start with attribution, because John brought it up and it turned into this nice little discussion. John, let's talk about attribution.
Okay, so attribution is a term that we use to talk about what you do, how you tell a reader who's speaking. He said, she said, think of it like that. But you can also, you can write a paragraph in a way where you show the speaker in action, and then the reader will assume that that person is speaking. So there's, I like to call that explicit, or there's an explicit, which is the he said, she said, and implicit attribution, where you imply it through, you see the person in action. So a lot of times, there's this sort of fad going around that you have to kill all he said, she said, because, it gets repetitive. But the reality is that those are usually invisible to the reader as long as they're not used redundantly. So if it's obvious that someone is speaking and then you say she said or she asked, then it's going to start to feel repetitive because the reader's like, well, I already know it's that person speaking. So a lot of writers just try to cut them all out, and you end up with, just people zipping across the room to grab their coffee cup just so that you could show them speaking, and that gets a bit clunky. So really, attribution is a subtle art. I know for myself when I edit, a lot of times it's about, or they won't put any attribution in, and it's like, you need to put something in here, and it's like, isn't it obvious who's speaking? It's like, well, no, the reader needs to get a little reminder of who's talking.
Absolutely. You were saying something, Katie, about it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I went to a workshop recently where someone said that I had too many attributes, and I disagreed, but I don't, because I know that like I have dealt with this, because when you're writing it, how many times you wrote it, so it starts to feel like a lot to you. You think, I just said he said up here. In reality, to the reader, that's like a whole scene ago or yesterday in the characters' lives. Like, they don't put it together as like sequentially as you do. So as a writer, it feels like sometimes you want to cut them because it feels like you're writing so many of them at once, but it's because you're writing it. The people reading it don't register it the same way, and I think that's like an important distinction to make.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, to offer sort of a counterpoint to that, though, I just recently listened to an audiobook of John Scalzi's Red Shirts, and he uses attribution. Like he does the exact same format of attribution throughout the entire book, and it feels really weighty when you're reading a scene in which 5 characters are talking to each other, and every line is followed by Dahl said, Martinez said, whatever, like it just follows with their name, and so said, so-and-so said, so-and-so said, and it's every single line, and it becomes really distracting. When I was listening to the audiobook, which was read really well, I just, like, it stopped being meaningful language and just turned into like a weird attached bite of sound at the end of like a piece of dialogue where it's like, Dahl said, at the end of every line,
I just read that book, but I read it, so I wonder, I mean, there's got to be a key difference between like listening to the audiobook and hearing it said over and over again, and reading it where you're just like, your eyes kind of skip over it.
I think that's the key point when it comes to, because it's invisible to a reader, but to a listener, it's different. Because as you're reading it, that said, or the explicit attribution, it just tells you, oh, this dialogue here belongs to this person. You don't necessarily picture them doing anything, but when you're hearing it read aloud, of course it's going to be distracting.
Yeah, it absolutely changes.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like, attribution is critical. Like, you want to err on the side of over attributing, probably, because it can get corrected later in editing. But if you have scenes that are ambiguous, where characters who are speaking to each other, like, you can't parse which character is speaking, to whom they're speaking, or whatever, then it'll be really difficult down the road. So, like, as you're working through your first draft,
in copy editing for me a bit, because I will note everywhere. I'm like, if I don't know who said it, I'll make a note there, because there's no way. A lot of times I can't figure out who said it in the scene, depending on how many people are in the scene. Like, there's no way for me to infer who said it, so I'll just have to make a note for the author. Like, I don't know who said this, you need to figure it out. Sometimes they don't know who said it. They just put it in.
Even in long stretches of dialogue between 2 characters, if you're not attributing at least every few lines, like, the reader will get lost. I've certainly gotten lost in a scene in a room with 2 people about who was talking.
Well, and formatting in dialogue has, I think, something to do with that. Like, how it's written on the page can be, if it's not consistent and in the format people expect, like, sometimes there'll be like a paragraph with dialogue included in it, and then a double space and then a separate line of dialogue, and you don't know if they've switched speakers or not. So the formatting is super important as far as like when you're switching speakers and to keep track of it.
Right.
Yeah. Do you think there's like a secret sauce for attribution, or, like it's just use all of the tools, use he said, she says, and use action to tell who's speaking, and maybe let a few of them go from time to time, just to like keep it fresh? Or is it simplify?
I mean, for me, it's like you have to sit down with your character and say, like, are they doing something? Are you forcing them to do something because you don't know because you want to say who's talking? or are they actually doing something? So I wouldn't put an action on them that they otherwise wouldn't be doing.
Yeah.
For the sake of dialogue. So like there is a good mix for sure, but like you just have to really think about like, is your character the kind of person who would be fidgeting while they're talking, in which case you can give them a ton of actions.
Yeah.
It's like whatever's more true to your character, I think.
Yeah, I tend to do things like inserting pauses, not as like ellipsis within the dialogue, but I'll use, comma, close quote, he paused, and
I
then
do that
reopen
too.
the quote, because it attributes it and it gives some action that is really natural within, the human speech. But I think I might do it too much. I'll tend to like break up a line of dialogue to be like, he yawned.
My characters
not
trail
necessary.
off a lot. Like, and it'd be like, comma, he trailed off. Like, instead of ellipses, because I'm very against ellipses.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they kind of, I always have I have a tough time with them when I'm editing. I'll see it and be like, I wish that this wasn't in here. Like, it's totally fine and it's grammatically correct, but something about it feels wrong to me.
It's
and
kind
that's
of
just
a
my
cheat,
own bias.
I think. Like, it's a cheat for, like, you can imply something without actually giving your character some motivation for doing that, or like explaining like he's pausing because it's painful or he's pausing because he's tired. It's kind of a cheat to just put an ellipses there and have the reader just be like, oh, I guess he's thinking. Like,
I'm remembering, as you're talking about this, I'm remembering there's a second book that I tried to write. Whenever I couldn't think of what to write next, I just had the person trail off with ellipses. So, as you're describing that, I'm remembering, and I think a lot of times they do give you an easy out, because it's easy to have someone start something and it's like, oh crap, I don't know where this is going. Okay, ... and then
exactly.
And of course, that's just going to piss off your reader, and so.
Exactly. That's how I feel about them. I'm against them in dialogue. I'm against them anywhere. I'm just against them.
Similarly, I have characters interrupt each other a lot, and I use an M dash. So like, if I don't know where something's going, I'll be like, so-and-so cuts in, like right in the middle of this line of dialogue, so that there's no, because sometimes, you write these lines of dialogue that feel super unnatural, and you're like, where's this going? I need to cut this off right here.
You need to stop talking.
Yeah, there's a, so attribution is, it's a fascinating way to look at things, but you can also give, you want to imbue your character's dialogue with a lot of personality, because
then you
can actually infer a lot about who's talking by the way that they talk, by their choice of words, by contraction use, by even sentence structure. If someone is like, there's a book that I recently read. The main character was kind of like hyperactive, and the way that was represented within dialogue was, there was very little pausing. There were a few commas, and the sentences were all correct, but they were kind of run-on-y because that was how this character spoke. And it made it really clear when she was speaking, even without attribution.
Well, and to your point, Elon, I just edited a manuscript where all of the characters' dialogue sounded the same, and I'm guessing that's how the author speaks, because everyone used the same. They started sentences with, well, this is what I think. Well, I'm going to go to the store. It's unrealistic that every single one of your characters, from like a peasant to like upper New York like echelon, is going to start a sentence with, well. And it made them all sound just really similar, and it was very confusing. And they didn't have personality. And then the attribution became really important because they all sounded the same. And so, that's one way to get around it, is just to make sure that your characters have clear personalities that's reflected in the dialogue, and that it's not necessarily you as a writer. That's not exactly how you sound. I probably have one character who sounds like me, and then you have to sort of branch from there and say, okay, not everyone can be like, dude, that's not cool.
Yeah, that's something that I've always struggled with as a writer, is, pulling my voice out of character dialogue. There's actually, so one of the first times I really noticed a really simple trick to achieving this kind of separation of characters was when I was reading the Wheel of Time series, because each of the characters has like a tick, like a verbal tick that they use. You've got your characters that say, like, you've got your Eeyore style character in Perrin who speaks a certain way, slowly and methodically, and kind of like, oh bother. And then you've got Matt Coffin who says blood and bloody ashes like every 2 words. And you've got all these other characters who have these sort of vocal ticks that make it very clear that it's their voice. And eventually, I think that they were able to develop actually more unique character voices, but you use those kind of ticks and you don't overuse them if you're struggling to imbue your characters with different voices.
Ron Weasley from Harry Potter, he always says bloody hell.
Yeah, totally.
Like every 3 sentences.
He does say it a lot.
Yeah.
And Hermione uses, I think, actually quite a bit.
Actually, yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I bet she does this when she does it too.
Oh, totally. The sweet pushing your glasses up on your nose.
Yeah.
That's so anime of you.
These ticks are okay as long as, I mean, in the case of Hermione, actually is a great tick because it so suits her personality. So I think if you choose a way of speaking that is revealing about someone's character, then that's great. That's exactly what you want to do.
But at the same time, you want to avoid certain pitfalls, right? Like, there's also things that you really shouldn't do to try to differentiate characters who are speaking, like using misspelling or bad grammar to indicate class, or to even do something worse, like indicate race using like broken language. Like, it's one thing to use like honest linguistic differences, but
Toni Morrison, don't do it. Okay, Toni Morrison is the only person who can do it.
Maybe her and like Octavia Butler.
Yeah, right. That's it. Like, don't go there. Don't do it. It's a bad idea, and it's annoying to read.
Yep.
Yeah, it's strongly inconsiderate to try to differentiate between people in terms of class and stuff by dropping. It's hard to describe, but it's and I certainly won't do a voice on the podcast, but you know what it would sound like, right? Don't do that in your writing. Don't do a caricature.
Well, and it happens a lot, I feel like, with like in the US, like Southern accents, right?
Yeah.
People want to write that with like using apostrophes, like IN apostrophe for all their gerunds and stuff. And
yeah, totally.
I might be more okay with that than anything else, but just like occasionally. But even then, I still think like you can add in descriptors of how they sound without having to like, I think again, it's a cheat, right? Like, I don't want to have to describe their Southern accent. So I'm just going to write it this demented way.
Totally. So I think another good example from The Wheel of Time, because they have so many characters with different accents. I can't remember the accent of the ship captain where he was from, but he had all of these phrases. He would say things like "by my own aged mother" and things like that. Phrases that were foreign, but were not offensive. Like you can do things like use idiomatic expressions or quirks of grammar. Like maybe they end a sentence differently frequently because that's how it's spoken wherever they're from, instead of making it seem like a caricature of people who aren't able to quote unquote speak normally. Yeah. I think that's really what it comes down to. That different speech, and this is a thing that comes down from like the Pigden languages, right? Like people racistly assume that because they sound like broken and different English, things like African American vernacular English are somehow inferior. They are somehow like inferior language, when in reality they're actually linguistically sophisticated and have a lot of really rigid rules that work because they're developed by a culture.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the best, somehow it is an example both for and against this. In East of Eden, there's a character who is Chinese. And he speaks like a weird pidgin. And then like halfway or more through the book, he works for like the main character in the house. And halfway or more through the book, you find out that he speaks perfect English, but he's purposely speaking a different way to make so that people aren't like, they don't make other assumptions about him. Yeah, or they just don't know the truth about him. He wants them to assume those things. So it's written specifically like pigeon style, I guess. Up until you find out that he's capable of
an
like
upper class gentleman.
Exactly, and I think
I think, I mean, there's historical examples of those kinds of things happening with great frequency, like the development of Yiddish and Ladino, say, for Jewish communities in Europe. They took elements of language from the world around them, German and Polish and Spanish and whatever, and inserted a bunch of their own, language into it and created what masquerades as a certain language, but is really a private language.
Yeah. And I think more importantly, like Steinbeck uses the way he writes it on the page to highlight the difference. Mm-hmm. Like, and I think that's like if it's for a purpose, like there's a clear purpose that's like a whole philosophy behind why he's doing it. Like that's totally different to me than just doing it so someone is from Kentucky.
Yeah.
Or whatever. Like
they can say y'all.
Yeah.
And that's fine.
We can all say y'all.
We can all say y'all. It is a really interesting conundrum, though, because you want to provide your characters with sort of a cultural differences, say, that are often represented in local dialects, and how do you differentiate between them without coming across as belittling or or whatever it is.
And one trick,
that subculture.
One trick that's actually used in a cartoon, Futurama, is there's a character named Amy Wong, and she speaks perfect English, but her parents are Chinese. So when she curses in Chinese.
Yep.
And that's just a good way to show maybe she speaks another language, maybe she has a little bit of an accent, but you don't need to it's not an important part of it doesn't speak to something else about her. It's just,
I mean, it says a lot about a person's connection to their ethnic heritage that they choose something as perhaps personally important as frustrated cursing in their mother tongue, right? I think that's actually a really good example. Cursing. Cursing is actually really important in
your
dialogue.
First language. That's mine.
Totally.
And everyone always understands it. No matter if they speak your language or not, they know when you are cursing at them. Mm-hmm. That's been my personal experience.
Yeah, 100% true. So we're about halfway through the show, and I want to go back to this idea of breaking the rules, which is sort of how this idea started. And I think that our conversation up till now has been fascinating, but it talks more about these sort of high level issues with dialogue and identity and character identity, which I think we can talk about character in another episode, in another season. We can talk about character probably for forever, because that's all stories really are. But let's talk more about this idea of grammatical rules and structure when it comes to dialogue, because as we said in the Breaking the Rules podcast a few weeks ago, the rules are fairly strict in narration, but when it comes to dialogue, they're a bit more malleable. In particular, I think that there are certain types of grammatic structures that you probably don't see often in spoken words because it's just not very natural to use. Can you guys think of any that are off the top of your head? I can't.
Not particularly.
One thing that
I got into an Sorry, go for it, John.
One thing that comes to mind when you're talking about, if you represent how people speak, we don't speak. If you were to record somebody, just write up a court transcript, for example. There's all kinds of things that people say when they're speaking that aren't pretty. Even if you were to, I know just listening to this, I said, and sometimes we go, and we have all these things. And if you try to capture real life, it's just gonna read very sloppy on the page. So dialogue, one thing that I read, I think it's from Self-Editing for Fiction Writers by Dave King and Rennie Brown. Very good book. And one thing that he mentioned in there is that dialogue is an idealized picture of how people speak. It's clean. It's the way it would sound if things came out perfect. And that's just how it's done in fiction. If you try to represent real life too accurately, you're going to throw readers off because that's not what they come to books to read about.
Yeah, they don't want to listen to you struggle to get a sentence out.
Yeah, I think sometimes for me the only time to really differentiate is like in the introduction of a character, it's like the first thing they're saying, and I want to make it clear that they're talking to a valley girl or something, then I will add in a like or an But then you can reference that instead of including it in the dialogue. You can say, and she said it with all of her usual likes and instead of including a like with commas every other word.
Yeah, it can grow a bit cumbersome, the use of those ticks. I think going back to the earlier example of character in The Wheel of Time, those ticks did become a bit cumbersome after 14 books. Like, okay, we get it.
Personally,
we get how these people talk.
Personally, I only think the word like works if you're writing as a 16-year-old girl, like a 16-year-old teenage girl in high school.
Yeah.
You know, I was born in California, and I have never stopped saying dude or like ever. Yeah. When I talk to my sister,
Californian dudes.
When I call my sister, I go, dude, you should have seen it. It was like, oh my God. It's just nonsense, you know?
Yeah.
And it is your job to clean that up and make it, you can use a sentence like that as an example of how someone talks, and you can be like, I don't understand them. What does that even mean? But you can't do it for very long.
I have had partial conversations as a token Californian that consisted entirely of the word dude. Dude. And that's not going to work in your fiction
it's
at
really
all
not.
Because there's a lot of paralinguistic stuff that happens with body language and with tone and with shifting tones within the individual dudes that really you can't put on the page.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and unless you're really unless the point is that your character is the outsider and they are watching a conversation like this happen and they're confused by it, you know, like you can make a sort of scene out of two people only saying dude and your character not understanding that. But
yeah, I mean, that's how you can show someone entering a magical world, like Harry Potter arriving in Diagon Alley,
right? And
hearing people talking about brooms using, language that makes a lot of sense, but
yeah,
it was foreign.
Then you still only get to do it once.
Yeah, because afterwards it's a little frustrating. I got into an interesting conversation with a fellow writer online about whether or not you could hear semicolons in speech. And I was arguing that you can't, and he was arguing that he can. But he also speaks very formally, so perhaps he can. And I don't want to necessarily judge his approach. I think that it's perfectly valid, but I have a hard time distinguishing between commas, em dashes, and all those kinds of different pauses that are really useful in the written word in speech.
I just got done editing a book where the author kept using and then she said semicolon dialogue.
Yeah, totally.
I know. That happens a lot because people don't know what happens between the attributes and the actual dialogue a lot of the times. And
what was really
err on the side of a comma, just usually.
Yeah. The thing is that was interesting about
that's usually the right answer.
What was interesting about that project, because that's something that I worked with Ian on, and it's interesting how everybody will learn the rules of grammar differently. Some people will pick up I mean, in terms of that manuscript, I'm sure that semicolon was the right thing to do, and so it's a simple correction. And of course, when we pointed out to the author, he's like, "Oh wow, okay, thanks," and he sort of has internalized it. But the thing is, if you don't ever get editing done on your work, you don't have somebody to sort of teach you that, by the way, this is the rule on semicolons or on in particular punctuation before you open dialogue. That's a tricky one. Sometimes people get tripped on whether there's a period or a comma or whatever the punctuation is.
Yeah. I did a manuscript where the error throughout, and John worked with me on this, where the error throughout was a period at the end of a line of dialogue followed by attribution or action that required a comma there. And I think that people assume that like a finished sentence means a period, even if it's within dialogue, but that's not necessarily the case. When someone speaks and then is, committing some kind of action while they speak, that means that you put a comma at the end of that line of dialogue. But there are times when that's not the case, if somebody sighs after dialogue, they're not sighing the line of dialogue necessarily. They sigh after the dialogue. So you might, where you might put in, he asked, say, after a line of dialogue, he sighed, is treated perhaps differently. Or he looked out the window, probably not being done while he's speaking. Unless it is, and it's a very dramatic moment.
Yeah,
well, and like you said, John, about like understanding the rules, and that's probably why the person you were talking to, Elon, couldn't hear a semicolon, is because they know where a semicolon belongs. Mm-hmm. So like if you understand the rules and you hear dialogue, you might say like, yeah, a semicolon would go there. But the reality is that like there's not that many people who can hear that. And it is really hard to imply that two clauses are related when you're talking.
Yeah.
They
because
can be related, but sure. I think it's hard to, just personally, I wouldn't include a semicolon in my dialogue probably because
depending on who is speaking, right? Like I think we talked about this in a previous episode that like someone who's aggressively formal might actually speak with a semicolon, but it's probably still fairly unlikely. I think, I've done a number of transcriptions of interviews and stuff for jobs and things like that. And the thing that I've noticed about the way people speak in this life thing is that they'll start a sentence and then in the middle of that sentence, they'll shift into another sentence. And that's a very natural thing for us to hear, but it's a very unnatural thing for us to write.
Yeah.
And so I think
that's why you have to change how people talk a little bit, like John was saying.
Yeah.
You just can't.
You can't just have
them.
fully authentic human speech because it would be bonkers and difficult to read.
It would be a monstrosity.
Yeah, and so I think I'm reading a manuscript now for an editorial evaluation, and the author has done a few things that I think are very unnatural for dialogue. Like refusing to use certain contractions, or having people call each other.
Contractions is my enemy.
Yeah, like it is. People very rarely say it is to each other. Almost never.
You will notice it, and I've done this with manuscripts through Story Perfect. It's like maybe when you're writing it, you just think, well, this character, is kind of formal, so they wouldn't use contractions. But even formal people use contractions. It's when there are zero contractions in the dialogue, they sound like robots. They sound really strange, and they lose some humanity. I think like they sound odd, and I will always add some in, even if the character. The one I usually settle on is cannot. Some people are like, I cannot do this. That sort of is an emphasis as opposed to just like it's is a great example because everyone says it's.
Yeah, it's I think is the most important one to continue to use.
What really irks me is when the author isn't very consistent with his contractions and like switches in between using them, then not using them for like whole paragraphs.
Oh yeah.
Especially when there's like different characters.
Key for sure.
Yeah.
Contractions are tricky to get somebody to correct because there's so many of them. So I found a nice website that has a huge list of them, and they said, "Go to town, go and search them." if you really want to, if you want to, because the thing is, if you decide that you want to create contractions and you want to kill some of that formal language, it's not a quick. I mean, it's easy to search for apostrophe and create. Destroy contractions if that was what you wanted to do for a character. But going the other way is tricky because there's so many words that you have to search to.
Yeah, if you have like a,
You're like, I'll just search
word
for
manuscript.
Is and not. That should be fine.
Yeah, that's right.
Is plus
you can decide which ones are your culprits, and that's the thing. That's why having editing helps because the editors. I mean, that's what we do when going over for a copy edit or an express edit. We catch that stuff, and I mean that's why it's there. But of course, when patterns emerge, and it's something that you could say, okay, go and search this word because you're always saying it is, and then we can send them on a hunt. And in fact, that's better for the author because the author then is more likely to internalize it.
Absolutely.
Well, yeah, and John, and we worked with an author like way long ago who I was like changing all the contractions and he didn't want me to because he was like, no, they don't use very many contractions. And I disagreed a little bit, but like that's what he wanted for his characters. And so like we sort of compromised and I was like, how about I add in a couple and I leave some? Because we had to sort of find a balance because I mean, like I wanted to say to him, like, it just doesn't sound quite right. And he was like, this is how I want them to sound.
Yeah,
so,
the recommendation that I've given several times to a number of authors is read your dialogue out loud. Maybe even have a person read it with you so that you have a back and forth and see if it feels like people talking to each other, if it feels, stilted and sort of glacial and unnatural.
If it sounds like you're talking with Christopher Walken, then you're doing something
with
wrong.
Christopher Walken.
No one wants that.
Nobody wants to talk to him. But another thing that I've noticed is a particular manuscript wherein people call each other by name constantly when they're speaking to each other, and I think that almost never happens. Like when I'm sitting with my girlfriend. I don't say to her, Crystal, what do you think about this? Like that's not
because you know who you're talking to.
Yeah.
And she understands your body language. She knows you're talking to her.
Yeah. And so like using, how do you feel about this, John? Would make sense if we were in a large group of people and it wasn't certain who I was speaking to. But in a small group where there is sort of a back and forth and there's a natural rhythm to the conversation, people don't call each other by name that frequently. And so things like that, which might seem like they're helpful attribution or demonstrating some kind of character trait, they're actually quite unnatural to hear.
They're a little unnatural, but I will say that given the lack of like body language that you have, sometimes you need it. But again, we're talking about like this is a small margin, but occasionally, like I think my characters probably like call each other their names more often than regular people would, but not so often that it's like noticeable. But just enough because I think that there's something about the writing sometimes that like says something about their relationship when they say each other's names. Right? But I think again, still it has to be with a purpose.
Yeah, absolutely.
It can't just be like, how's the weather, Elon? Like, it has to be like, we need to do this, Elon. This is important. Like,
yes, absolutely. That is the case. It's emphasis. It's using a person's name to really get their attention in some kind of deeper way, as opposed to being like, it's hot out today, Katie.
Exactly. And then you're like, thanks, Elon. That was weird. Yeah. Now, one grammatical point I wanted to make, just what we did like the ellipses earlier, is that I want to talk about exclamation points because I'm against them. Yeah. I don't want them in dialogue. And I think a lot of people think like that's the one place they are okay, but I think it's still a cheat because exclamation point just means loud. And there's so much more to what your character is saying than just volume, obviously. Like, certainly. I think that's a point where you need a really descriptive follow-up. Like, if they're yelling, then you need to do something with that. An exclamation point is just volume. It's useless to your character as far as like their story and their feelings. So
to be honest, I don't 100% agree.
Yeah.
Even though like 99% of the time I do. But I have a hard time when a line ends with a comma during a really intense sequence. Yeah. When it's followed by he shouted or, she bellowed. Like those kinds of actions to me sort of call for an exclamation point. And it seems like we have to get out of here, comma, she bellowed. Doesn't feel like a bellow to me.
Dave, John, get over here. Comma.
Yeah, comma. But
I guess this is also situational. Like I err on the side of just never using them because I hate them. But that's just like it's a personal choice. But like your example, Ian, if you're like, hey, John, get over here, and there's nothing following it, then like an exclamation point does make sense there.
Yeah.
But I think like if we're talking about like an argument, then there's so much more you can say without
absolutely.
the exclamation point than with it.
I think that action sequences might call for them, whereas almost nothing else does.
The rule that I like to apply, and of course there are exceptions, but I generally go by this. He shouted, bellowed, like those sorts of where you're talking about, you're spelling the exclamation mark out, then you don't need it.
Exactly.
But if you're cutting, that's implied by the exclamation mark. So it's kind of like whether you say, hey, he said or not, or whether you're just going to let it be implied by context. Now, that said, I think the way that sentence is phrased, you have to be careful, because the example you gave, Elon, was incorrect. Like, if somebody put, he bellowed and didn't use an exclamation mark, it's a bit strange. Like, you should put the bellowing before, like describe, his volume was raised or something like that. Like, just say something to prime us so that the words we read are somebody who's agitated and speaking loud. Then we, what follows, we already know it's going to be, raised volume, and we don't need the exclamation mark. So there's a lot of ways around that. So it's really just as long as it's not awkward. But the one thing is sometimes it's used redundantly. Like you'll use an exclamation mark and then you'll say so and so bellowed or shouted, and you don't need to do that. So
thank you. I learn something every day. So we've actually gone over time a little bit, but this has been a fantastic discussion, and I really appreciate the information and the knowledge that you all shared. Is there anything that you guys want to add? Any final thoughts about breaking the rules in dialogue or rules in dialogue in general?
I would just say, just stay true to your character, most of all. Stay true to the story. If you think what's really right for your character is for them to speak a certain way, then, you should go with it, and then ask an editor if it sounds okay. But, really just stay true to the characters and who they are. And I think for the most part, you'll be fine.
Well, I'll add something. My takeaway would be trust your editor. There's more to say than that.
Yeah.
Dialogue is one of the nuances that I think when you're developing fiction and moving it towards publication, a lot happens in dialogue just because it's, capturing that balance is so important. A lot of things that throw a story off kilter is imbalances in how a scene where there's dialogue is put together. So you can have a brilliantly executed, like just where what's happening in terms of dialogue really moves the narrative forward. But if there's all kinds of things that throw it off kilter and confuse your reader, you're going to totally lose all that momentum. So,
Agreed.
All right.
How about you, Ian? Any final thoughts?
No, not really. I'm just...
Awesome. Well, thank you for suggesting this. It was a really good conversation. Yeah. I learned a lot, and it gives me a lot to think about as I work on my own fiction, because I fall victim certainly to the everyone sounds pretty similar situation right now, and I'm trying to imbue characters with voice a little bit more effectively, and I think that erring on the side of extreme is going to be helpful in that, like trying to insert those tics or a lot of really obvious differences in the way people talk, word choice, things like that will be helpful as I try to differentiate between my characters more clearly as they speak to each other. So hope you enjoyed the podcast, listeners. Join us in the future when we'll be talking about book covers and why you should judge books by them. Anyway, thank you very much, podcasters, for joining me. Thank you, listeners, and we'll see you next time.